So hello everybody, this is Bante Joe here, and I'm just here at a village kuti in Gampaha and thought to record a short Dhamma discussion for the internet. So I thought that could start with just a little bit of meditation, so can lean forward a little bit and arch the spine and look about 3 feet in front and close our eyes. And can focus in on the breath. Can know when it's coming in and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And can focus in on the breath at the tip of the nose. And if notice any patterns of tension or tightness around the nose, around the face, can just let those relax. And can just watch the breath. Just allowing the mind to observe as the breath comes in, as the breath goes out. And we can spend some time contemplating impermanence. You can just think in the mind of something that is well loved right now, is stable right now. Maybe one's car, one's house, one's health, one's children. And one can imagine that thing deteriorating, that thing falling away. The house growing old and breaking down. Floors and walls rotting. Pipes gradually leaking. Cobwebs accumulating. And reflect that this doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the laws of nature, the laws of impermanence. Imagine one's body growing old, aging. One's eyesight dimming. hair growing gray, and losing various abilities. The ability to remember, the ability to think clearly, the ability to walk. This body doesn't belong to me. It's impermanent, subject to the laws of nature. And from whatever thing one might love, one can expand that contemplation to everything. Everything that's subject to arising is subject to ceasing. It's not me. It's not mine. It's not myself. And to cling to it brings suffering. And since these things are impermanent, can incline the mind away from them. Can incline the mind to try to find something that's safe. And so it can reflect, this is peaceful, this is sublime, the stilling of all formations, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the cessation of craving, dispassion, Nibbana. Can incline the mind that Nibbana is safety. And can open our eyes and do a short Dhamma discussion for the internet. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So I hope that everybody's keeping well wherever it might be. And Vasa season is coming to an end. The first Vasa is over. I still have another month left of second Vasa. And so was actually asked a question on the internet the other day by a gentleman, and he asked basically, could you give a talk about Sakkaya Ditthi and basically explain how it arises and how to overcome it. So Sakkaya Ditthi it's one of the three primary fetters that bind a person to samsara. So you might call it like a very root defilement. The other two that it gets coupled up with are Silabbata Paramasa and Vicikiccha. And these things can all kind of connect. They all kind of connect to make one's world worth living in, basically. They're what makes a person believe that it's useful, that it's important to stay in samsara, that it's something that's important to do. So Sakkaya Ditthi is the fetter that basically means that one believes, not just as an intellectual proposition, but one believes that there's a permanent entity in what the Buddha calls the all. This is the I, the nose, the ear, the tongue, the body, and one's mind, and the external objects. And these two things come together and create a consciousness. So basically there's some kind of permanent entity inside of this. It's a gross belief in this. Now, this gross belief doesn't just mean an intellectual proposition. What it actually means is that one is sustained by samsara, and this Sakkaya Ditthi is like a root that can grow back. You can cut the top off of it. Think to yourself, well, there's no permanent self, but the root is still there because one feeds off samsara in such a way that it's like there's a permanent entity there somewhere. This kind of belief is buried. So when a person dies and gets reborn, they forget everything that they've learned, basically, unless they're reborn in a spontaneous order of devas. So if one dies and gets reborn as a human, one still has this root of Sakkaya Ditthi, even if one studied the Buddhist texts really well and thinks intellectually, no, there's no permanent self in samsara, the potential for one to latch on to the idea of like a soul is still there. And this is something that gives one a strong sense of safety. I remember when I was a business student, I was a student, and one of my fellow students had this nice opportunity to go on exchange down to Latin America. And he came back and he said, one of the things that I learned is that wherever we go, we still take this kernel, this essence of who we really are with us. So there's various things in samsara that people believe, not just as an intellectual proposition, but they feed on it as their self, as a permanent entity. The most common one that you tend to hear about is that there's this kernel of a self in the personality. And it's kind of, one notices that one's friends, even if one hasn't seen them for 20 years and one knew them when they were a kid, and one meets them later, there's still like this kernel. You can see that their personality still has this kind of core part to it. And so that being the case, it's actually very easy for a person to start to think, this is who I am. Not just as an intellectual proposition again, but they latch onto it, they feed on it. This is who I am, this is something safe. A lot of this is oftentimes bound up with a person's body. Even intellectually, you think, the body's not self, it's not going to age. One behaves in such a way, one feeds in such a way that one is acting like the body is oneself. So this Sakkaya Ditthi coupled with Silabhata Paramasa. Silabhata Paramasa is often translated as rites and rituals. What it basically means is that one doesn't believe one's going to get the consequences of one's actions in line with kamma. This is another thing that makes it worthwhile to live in samsara. And the third one, vicikiccha, or doubt, is basically a doubt in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean an intellectual proposition of doubt. It means that the kernel is there and it can re-arise when one's kind of intellectually accepted something. This comes from avijja, this kind of covering over. One doesn't want to see what it's really like. And one doesn't want to see what it's really like to search after a particular sensual pleasure and even to get it. So when one's mind is, when one is anticipating some particular type of sensual pleasure, then when one is anticipating and anticipating and anticipating, when one gets it, the mind is gone. One doesn't want to see that. It's uncomfortable to keep the mind in the present moment at the time when one has finally gotten the object of one's desire, because it eliminates the ability to get this pleasure of blanking out. Now, this pleasure of blanking out is avijja. It's what doesn't allow one to see what it really causes one to be happy and what causes one to suffer. It's this not wanting to see. That not wanting to see, so long as that is strong enough in terms of the three fetters, that one does not have this kind of inability to turn away from the Dhamma, this can be a kernel for doubt in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So these things are not an intellectual proposition. Not just an intellectual proposition. So in terms of the way that one can work to overcome Sakkaya Ditthi, again, it teams up with these other two. These three things can kind of glom together, or the way that one learns can try to overcome this is, one of the classic ones is to contemplate impermanence. This is impermanent. This is not going to last. And then also, one wants to observe carefully the cause and effect relationships that exist in samsara. What is it that causes me to be happy, and what is it that causes me to suffer? I want to be happy. Is this really giving me happiness? And one has to keep one's mind there in the present moment when one is happy. Really observe the feeling of happiness. Really observe what the anticipation was. What's the new promotion given? What's the new house given? What's the reputation given? It's when one stops oneself from feeding on these things that one has the opportunity to observe what they really give. And this is when one has the opportunity to cut these things. So Sakkaya Ditthi in and of itself, one can try to attack it the classical way and basically, intellectually, if one has a gross intellectual belief in a soul. And one of the ones that gets into Buddhist culture these days is actually this belief in kind of consciousness being this permanent entity. Is basically one is just being the observer and observing, and when everything else falls away, that observer, that's the true self. And that's a kind of a Sakkaya Ditthi. It's a gross view that consciousness is something safe. In Buddhism, this is consciousness. One doesn't experience anything outside of what the Buddha calls the all, unless one is basically a body witness or becomes an arahant and one has a direct experience of Nibbana. Until that time, if one is not a body, or until that time, if one experiences until the time one experiences Nibbana, or if one is a body witness, one becomes a stream enter or one of the other stages possibly, then there's nothing that one experiences that one can take as a self. Not in one's meditation, not in anything else. All these things are subject to these laws, and all of them are going to have the same characteristics. So one learns to overcome this gross view on an intellectual level, kind of that there's something in one's experience that is a true self. And then to attack it further, one has to team up, and one can team up and start to attack the other defilements as well. Wait a minute. The inputs that I'm putting into this, do they ever give me the happiness that I want? Am I ever getting the happiness that I want from it? Now, the Buddha compares sensual pleasures to this chain of bones that's been well scraped, and one throws it to a dog, and the dog gets nothing out of it. Or to a burning grass torch, one is holding the torch and it comes back and burns one. So one has to observe these characteristics and the things that one loves. And this is why people don't like to do it. It's uncomfortable to do because one feeds off of the things that one loves. This is where Sakkaya Ditthi can hide. It can take root. It takes root in these views. I've got these various things that I love. I've got them because I've got this skill, this characteristic. All these things get wiped out when one dies. One has to rebuild them. And it's not necessarily a sure thing that one's going to be able to do it, or that one will even have the same mental faculties, the same disposition, the same genetics, or whatever it might be that allow one to do that. One doesn't even get born as a human all the time. Get born as an animal, as a slug, right? It's kind of, these possibilities exist. So hiding within the things that a person loves, hiding within the aspects of samsara that a person loves, cherishes, and protects the most, within one's attachment to these things, Sakkaya Ditthi can hide. One has to observe where it is that one thinks there's something that one owns. I think there's a sutta, I can't remember where it is. I think there's a sutta where basically the Buddha says for there to be a self, there has to be things that a self owns. So one looks to the things that one owns and tries to eliminate one's attachment to them. So in other words, this is not just a separate thing. It couples up with one's usual meditation practice to try to eliminate the defilements that one has, develop the good qualities that one has. Because it's hiding in these things that one knows one causes one to suffer. It's hiding in these things is one's attachment usually to something one loves. And one pulls back from the things that cause one to suffer. One realizes there's an element of liking in there that causes one to attach to these things in the first place. So it's in pulling back from these things and stopping the feeding on them that one can actually learn to see where these where it is that one's attaching and why, basically. It's when one can step back from these things enough that one's samvega, one's distaste or disgust in samsara grows. This kind of disgust, something that it spreads out to everything. There's nothing in one's experience that one wants to hold on to because it all is unsatisfactory. It doesn't satisfy at any time. And coupled with this is this growing of what they call chanda. Chanda is usually a good thing in the Pali Canon. It basically means desire. This desire for something that does not have these characteristics, where basically it's something that's unstable. It's something that the inputs that one puts into it are never worth the outputs. That the main pleasure one gets from it is this pleasure blanking out. or one goes to examine what it is one thinks is so nice about this, and one only feels like these kind of, oh, this is a little salty. One examines the feeling. Is this feeling really that satisfying? It's all a delusion. What keeps people bound to samsara is a delusion. So it's when one really sees this for oneself, these two qualities grow strong enough that one can actually try to cut these fetters. It's not necessarily something one does by thinking, I'm going to cut Sakkaya Ditthi. Although, whatever way one is moving forward, there's so many different ways one can move forward in the Buddhist path. When these qualities grow, this samvega and this chanda, this desire, these qualities grow to the extent that they can propel one's mind beyond samsara. So this is why we have this reflection. This is peaceful, this is sublime, the stilling of all formations, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the cessation of craving, dispassion, Nibbana. And it's looking for something that is not conditioned, something that's safe. So Sakkaya Ditthi is not to be confused with asmimana. Sakkaya Ditthi is this gross view. I have this thing in samsara that's mine. Asmimana is the more subtle thing, like the conceit I am this person. The two are separate. Asmimana is something that gets eliminated from an arahantship. Sakkaya Ditthi gets eliminated at stream entry. And for a person who wants to slowly attack it, slowly eliminate it, then that is the way that the Buddha described. One eliminates basically one's defilements, starts developing one's good qualities, and eventually this allows one to see what it is that one thinks makes it worthwhile to keep coming back and getting reborn. The answer is hidden in the things that we love often. It's hidden in our children. It's hidden in our house. It's hidden in our relatives, the things that we really love, the things that we don't want to contemplate as impermanent, the things that we don't want to see the flaws in. Doesn't mean that we have to, tell people we're never going to talk to them again. It means we have to see the limitations in these things, and that the primary thing in our life has to become Dhamma. So Sakkaya Ditthi teams up with these other fetters. It teams up and is actually the things that make our life worth living. It's a delusion. It doesn't mean that we have to commit suicide. It means that we have to relinquish the desire that keeps us feeding on these things. This is the way to cut Sakkaya Ditthi and the other fetters as well. So one can approach it through impermanence. One can approach it through concentration. There's so many different topics that the Buddha uses that one can use to develop in his dispensation, but it's approached through this samvega, through dispassion. Dispassion has to grow. Desire for something beyond it has to grow. These two things come together enough, then one can permanently cut this kernel that exists. And even when one gets reborn, one cannot latch onto that again. It's impossible. So Sakkaya Ditthi is something very root. It's something very radical. And start with the intellectual proposition. What is it that I think is really mine? What is it that I think is myself? And we'll go, what is it that's really mine? Is my car, my kids, my house, my body, my life, is this really mine? And one can let it grow until one has the opportunity to cut this kernel out, to completely eliminate Sakkaya Ditthi, so that one can incline one's mind to something that's really safe. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.